There are many Terran phrases that terrify the galaxy. A soldier fears, "You're going down with me." A merchant fears, "Can I speak to the manager?" A delinquent fears, "Fuck around and find out." But everyone fears, "Get off my property." You see, the Terran economy is structured differently to the rest of the galaxies. Millennia of regulation, interference, monopolies and trade has led most races down the route of corporatism. Every socio-economic sector is dominated by one body, be it government or monopoly, and little goes on without their consent. For the sake of cooperation and unity, many races have codified this into law, stifling the chance of any individual entrepreneurship. The Terrans did things differently. Relatively isolated from other major powers in the Orion Arm, humanity had a plethora of systems to colonize and resources to establish. Once they achieved FTL travel, millennia-old policies were dusted off as a new age of colonization and exploration began. Now, the Terrans were not one united group as they are now. Nearly a dozen major and hundreds of minor powers fought for dominance. Coming out of the Third Interplanetary War, the governments had a bounty of planets to settle, but precious few resources to do so. Colonization and terraforming was expensive, dangerous and time-consuming. 3 words that no government wants to hear. One of the major nations, the translation phonetic, Americans, instituted a set of policies that facilitated both its and humanity's rise to dominance. Despite emerging victorious at the end of the war, the nation was still weakened and drained by the conflict. Having gone through several such situations in the past, they concluded that the only way to recover was to aggressively expand outwards. Making many bold territorial claims, the Third Homestead Act was initiated. This set off a chain reaction whereby every other power did the same, each frantically rushing to carve out a piece of the galaxy as their own. Although, making claims was one thing, but enforcing them was another. To enforce every system taken would have drained their governance long before First Contact, so they turned to their citizens. Essentially, their policy was that anyone who could settle on a celestial object and develop it in some way therefore had the right to own it. This initially resulted in some rather hilarious instances of prospectors placing a wood plank over a ditch, proclaiming it to be a bridge, and declaring ownership over the entire planet, but kings such as these were eventually ironed out. Given that national militaries at the time lacked the ability to defend such territory, and that said territory were often inhospitable death worlds, very loose weapons laws were adopted so that frontiersmen could defend themselves and their property. Many of these properties, often beginning as single-person habitats delivered from orbit, would grow into massive estates and corporations as they were passed down through the family. Household names such as Clayton Defense, Browning Ballistics, and Clay Shipbuilding began from such humble beginnings. Eventually, this resulted in the belief of going out and defending what is yours being ingrained into nearly every Terran culture. When the first Terran-Nathiki War began, the Nathiki took one look at the fragile worlds lacking any major military presence and laughed. They were facing nothing but civilians. It should have been an easy fight. As they learned the hard way, humans do not give up. This was how the Nathiki lost their first High General in over 140 cycles. Not to a professional and skilled army, but to a 69-year-old small business owner by the name of Sigmus Chad with a kinetic hunting rifle on Sugandi's Free. The High General was a fairly arrogant person who was entrenched in the Nathiki culture of honor at the time, and travelled to the planet's surface to personally offer the citizens a chance to surrender. They would be taken into slavery within the Empire, but would be given good positions as butlers or aides. This, he reasoned, was only fair, seeing as their government abandoned them. The pity he felt for the Terrans was not reciprocated. While the High General spoke in the planet's capital at Limar Square, Mr. Chad watched as a pair of Nathiki soldiers began taking goods from his store. Shooting them dead with a suppressed kinetic pistol, he walked upstairs into his residence, opened the window, and shouted the infamous words of, "Get off my property!" The High General could only turn in confusion, and watched as the barrel of Sigmus's rifle was pointed at his head. Although Sigmus would be later executed, his actions earned him a spot in history, and a statue in the square, right above where the High General fell dead. The remains of his store will be declared a Terran historic site, with money from the tourism generated funding Sugandi's Freeze, meteoric growth. Sigmus's name would rapidly enter the Terran vernacular, with Chad often being used to refer to a strong, assertive, and defiant character. Across the Terran frontier, as more Nathiki forces invaded, they were met with similar resistance, effective to a terrifying degree. Civilian militias would fight in sieges, form guerrilla warfare bands, and conduct espionage on nearly every planet until the main military could arrive. Nathiki commanders would often struggle over the position of orbital bombardment, the resources present making such an endeavour unthinkable, but the nigh uncannibal resistance making it all the more reasonable. Eventually, the remaining Terran nations would come to unite following their triumph at the end of the war, continuing their rapid expansion as the truth of the galaxy came to light. That is why Get Off My Property is so terrifying. Not because it is a warning, but a promise. Nothing can stand between a Terran and what's theirs. If the war machine of one of the most powerful militaries in the galaxy can be ground to a halt by a Terran militia with hunting rifles and hunting weapons, Terran weapon regulations are more of an opinion than a law in many rule systems. Then what can the galaxy do against the entire species?